Nick, we've been talking about this thing around, application security posture management, cloud security posture management, identity security posture management, and we've never really looked into the crazy world of security standards. And I mean, Nick, we talk about standards like it's the de facto thing in your world, right? But a lot of organizations don't really spend enough time, having a look at what this is and also how Microsoft provides this. And it's super simple, right? When we look at the world, this is typically where everyone is, right? It's a picture of the globe, and it's Microsoft data centers across the world. And things that are important to America might not be important to Europe, might not be important to Africa, and so forth, so on. We've got different standards, legislative, regulative. GDPR is a regulation, it's not legislative, so it's not approved by the country. The European Union says you have to abide by that. And then we've also got fiduciary requirements like PCI DSS, and we'll see a little bit about that later. But typically, the reason why most people are here is because they have some investment in one of those dots on the screen and they're hosting something in Microsoft Cloud. Now, for those who don't know, these globally operated data centers by Microsoft actually adheres to or is compliant in various compliance offerings.
That's
The
right.
last time, this is not an exhaustive list, but the last time I checked, they were compliant in or they adhered to over 100 standards across the globe. And you'll notice how they've got global standards, they've got specific US government standards, they've got industry standards like PCI DSS and HIPAA High Trust, and they've also got regional standards that apply specifically to individual countries. Like in South Africa, we've got to be POPIA compliant, and that's one of the standards that Microsoft subscribes to or is compliant in. And it's available to you. And I think that's what I'm trying to get across here is that these things are available to you. Microsoft also, based on a shared responsibility model, has to conform to these standards in order to offer services to industry verticals like petrochemical, oil and gas, healthcare, and so forth, so on. So even though you don't necessarily have a standard today, know that Microsoft, I suppose, and it's funny to say, Microsoft has got your back when it comes to these standards. And when we talk about standards and frameworks, and we're going to unpack that, over the course of the next, 30 minutes before we jump into a live demo and what you should be changing or what you should be applying to your current tenant, I think it's important to understand the differences, right? And Nick, I'm just going to slide through these things so I can give you more time to look at these things. Now, there is a difference between a framework and a standard. And Nick, I always thought NIST was a standard.
It's interesting, isn't it? And I think it's worth calling out very quickly for our folks in English, talking about barbecues and family barbecues, not that we barbecue our family members anymore because that thins the herd and they don't want to come to the barbecue anymore. But the great thing about having a framework, or actually, if I were to explain to a normal human being what a framework is, it's really simple. Follow the rules and prove you're doing it. And something that you've called out a number of times, Al, is that you follow the rules because you need to, not because you want to. Often it's because you want to stay in business, or if you're in the medical industry, you have to follow specific rules. If you are a listed business or financial institution, follow the rules and then prove you're doing it.
Mm. And it was interesting to note that NIST is not a standard. I mean, I've done work for nuclear regulators that, they comply to NIST, but it's a framework. Whereas from a compliance perspective, when we look at standards like an ISO, it's a simple one, 27001. If you're in mining manufacturing, you have to have an ISO certification. If you are in the fintech industry and you're a bank, you need to be PCI DSS. It's an actual standard that you need to subscribe to, and you can't just follow the framework, right? When we look at frameworks, it's a little bit different. Now, I'm sure there's maybe one person that knows what COBIT is. I'm the other person on the call that knows what COBIT is. But I mean, NIST is there. CSF is a port of NIST. And then your personal favorite, Nick, Zero Trust, which you've been advocating for the last 3 years. How does, and you mentioned it earlier, Nick, for you, which one would you start with? I suppose it's probably the easiest question.
Well, we would start with our why. If I have got anything to do with government or I just want something really rigorous, I would start with NIST, because it does come from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which you could also call the official guidelines for making things secure. If we think about zero trust, it's trust no one and verify everything. However, it's more of a interpretive approach, as opposed to with NIST, you have very exact standards and controls to follow one at a time. So it really does depend. If you don't know where to start with zero trust and embrace one of the many implementations that you can follow, even sometimes step by step, as long as we understand the difference between, as you said, a framework and a strategy, because they're not the same thing.
Mm. Yeah, I was very interested in how it's actually, how it actually fits into the rest of the world and how we actually bring this back into what these things look like. And I suppose this is not a key takeaway slide, but it's also important for you to understand the differences. Like, when you look at a standard, it's specific and prescriptive, exactly what you said, whereas a framework like Zero Trust, or even working with something like CIS, which most organizations we've sort of dealt with over the last 5 years, Nick, they would normally say, well, where do we start? We recommend starting with Zero Trust, understand the tenets of Zero Trust. And if you want to know about Zero Trust, I think we've got a webinar coming up, or we've already talked about, the 3 tenets or the 5 or 6 tenets, depending on who you ask. Start with a framework and work yourself into a standard, because a lot of these things are sort of cross-pollinated, and we've actually got a slide that talks to that. But right. I suppose for me, the big key difference is when you look at the focus, it's specific requirements around compliance. You need to be compliant someone gives you the certificate. Whereas a framework is, it's this continuation of being able to improve, and we've heard these words from Microsoft for the longest time, your posture, right? They talk about security posture, your compliance posture, your identity posture. And it's always been there for making sure that organizations it's not a one size, you drop a firewall, port open, port closed, traffic routing, and it's done, right? It's a continuous evaluation.